Chandelier, the ballroom of the Marlowe estate glistened with opulence. Lauder rang through the marble hallways, and the air was thick with the sweet scent of roses imported from Italy. Wealthy men in tailored suits exchanged sly handshakes, while women in flowing gowns sparkled under the glittering crystal chandeliers. This was no ordinary evening. It was the annual Marlowe Foundation Gala, where the rich and powerful came not only to flaunt their fortunes, but to silently measure each other's worth. Yet amid the glitter and glory, an unease lingered in the shadows. Victor Marlowe, the man who owned this empire of glass and steel, stood tall in a midnight, blue tuxedo. His name was a brand. His fortune built from sweat, strategy, and a ruthless climb through the corporate jungle. People called him the king of real estate, a man who could turn abandoned ruins into palaces of fortune. Tonight, he played his part well, the composed host, smiling faintly as he greeted dignitaries, mayors, and business titans. But deep within, Victor carried a restlessness, one that no applause or wealth could quiet. That restlessness found a trigger in a single, shocking moment. It began when the tall glass doors of the ballroom opened and a figure walked in. A young man, no more than 21, his hair tousled, his clothes simple, eyes carrying the quiet strength of someone who had endured more than his years allowed. Some recognized him instantly. Ethan Marlowe, Victor's only son. But instead of admiration, whispers curled through the crowd like smoke. Why had Ethan returned uninvited, after being gone so long? Victor's gaze sharpened. His chest tightened, though his face betrayed nothing. Ethan had left their mansion months ago, choosing a modest apartment and part-time jobs over the luxury his father provided. He had wanted independence, a life built not on his father's name but his own. Victor, furious at what he considered rebellion, had cut ties. For Victor, success demanded obedience, loyalty, and above all, control. Ethan had shattered all three. And now here he was, standing in the middle of the gilded ballroom as though he belonged. At first, the guests' chatter softened into curiosity. But then, like a cruel wave, it shifted. A servant in a crisp uniform hurried over, a man too eager to display his authority in front of the powerful crowd. He placed a firm hand on Ethan's arm and hissed loud enough for others to hear. "You shouldn't be here. You were told not to return." Now. The words cracked through the room like a whip. Gasps fluttered across jeweled necks. Glasses froze midair. Ethan's face remained calm, though the sting in his eyes betrayed a storm beneath. He didn't resist, didn't argue. He simply stood as though absorbing the humiliation, his jaw clenched but his voice silent. And that was when Victor Marlowe froze. It was as if time itself had paused. He stood just a few feet away, his hand gripping a glass of champagne, the reflection of his sun flickering in the golden liquid. His heart pounded against his ribs with a violent force he hadn't felt in decades. Here, before hundreds of witnesses, his own flesh and blood was being dragged out like a servant. Like an intruder in a home that should have been his sanctuary. Memories, sharp and unbidden, flashed in Victor's mind. Ethan as a boy, running barefoot through the garden. His laughter echoing in the summer air. The time he had fallen off a bicycle and Victor, though busy, had dropped everything to rush him to the hospital. The look in Ethan's eyes the day he declared he wanted to find his own way, and the anger that had clouded Victor's judgment in response. And now this. His son, shamed in public. Because he had been cast aside by his own doing. Victor's grip tightened until the glass cracked, a thin line running along its surface. The chatter of the room grew louder. Some laughing under their breath, others leaning closer to savor the drama of the Marlowe family unraveling before their eyes. For a man who had built empires, who had commanded boardrooms, this should have been nothing but a trivial spectacle. Yet, it cut deeper than any business loss ever had. The servant tugged at Ethan's arm again, pulling him toward the exit. Ethan's eyes lifted. Just once, meeting his father's across the sea of glittering gowns and black tuxedos. They were steady, unyielding, yet carrying a quiet ache that only a father could understand. It wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't anger. It was something worse, it was resignation. A silent declaration: "I knew you wouldn't stop this." That single glance ignited something Victor hadn't felt in years. Rage, not the cold, calculated rage he used in negotiations, but a primal protective fire. The kind only a father could know. He slammed the fragile glass onto a nearby tray, shattering it into a dozen glittering shards. The sound echoed across the ballroom, silencing every laugh, every whisper. All eyes turned toward him. Waiting. Victor Marlowe's voice cut through the air, low and thunderous. The kind of voice that once commanded legions of men and built empires out of nothing. "Take your hand off my son." The servant froze, wide-eyed. Murmurs surged through the crowd, confusion rippling like a storm. Victor began walking forward, each step deliberate, the sound of his polished shoes striking against the marble floor like drums of war. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, burning, dangerous, were locked on the man who dared to treat his son like an outcast. The servant stammered, "But sir, he wasn't invited." Victor stopped inches away, his towering presence casting a shadow over both Ethan and the trembling servant. He leaned in, his voice a growl. "He's my blood. My son never needs an invitation to stand where I stand." The servant's hand dropped instantly, retreating as though burned. Ethan stood still, silent, his expression caught between disbelief and guardedness. The crowd, unsure of whether to applaud or recoil, held its collective breath. Victor turned, sweeping his gaze across the glittering hall. His words were not just for the servant. They were for every person present. "Anyone here who believes my son is beneath them, leave my house tonight." The silence that followed was electric, and in that silence, the story of Victor and Ethan Marlowe had only just begun. The silence in the ballroom was almost suffocating. For a crowd accustomed to elegance, laughter, and the constant performance of wealth, Victor Marlowe's outburst landed like thunder in a summer storm. Guests shifted in their seats, eyes darting between father and son, measuring their reactions. The chandelier lights shimmered above, but the true weight of the moment was not in gold or crystal. It was in the sharp, unspoken battle between pride, love, and shame. Ethan stood motionless. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his hands were tight fists at his sides, knuckles white. For months, he had braced himself to be invisible in his father's world. A shadow, a discarded ear. To be pulled into the center of attention now, in front of the very people who had laughed at his absence, was unbearable. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Victor, however, was far from finished. He straightened, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is my son, Ethan Marlowe. You will not treat him as less. Not in this house, not in my presence." The crowd reacted as one might expect, a handful of nervous claps, scattered and unsure. A few polite nods. Most remained stiff, their gazes laced with silent judgment. These were people who thrived on weakness, who measured worth in assets and leverage. Tonight, Victor had given them a spectacle. A crack in the armor of the untouchable tycoon. Victor turned his attention back to Ethan, searching his son's eyes for a flicker of gratitude, of connection, of anything that could bridge the months of silence between them. But Ethan's gaze was guarded, as though a wall of steel separated his heart from his father's sudden defense. "Come," Victor said softly, gesturing toward the grand table at the front of the hall. "You'll sit beside me." For a moment, Ethan hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to refuse, to walk out and prove that he needed none of this. None of the chandeliers. None of the whispered approval, none of the father who had pushed him away. But something in Victor's tone, raw and almost pleading, kept him rooted. Without a word, Ethan followed. The crowd parting reluctantly as the two Marlowes walked side by side. Victor pulled out a chair at the head of the table, offering it to Ethan. The gesture, though simple, carried the weight of an empire. Ethan sat slowly, feeling the stairs bore into his back. Victor remained standing, raising a hand for silence once more. "You all came here tonight to celebrate success, wealth, power," Victor said, his voice steady now, calm but commanding. "But none of it, none, is worth more than blood. Then family. Let it be clear, I will not sacrifice my son to satisfy the pride of any guest in this room." A heavy pause followed. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others whispered. A few applauded more firmly this time, though their faces betrayed how much of it was performance. Yet Victor didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't speaking to impress them, he was speaking to reach his son. The speeches of the night went on, the charity auction resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Some guests left early, unable to stomach what they saw as weakness. Others lingered, curious about the unfolding drama within the Marlowe dynasty. But Victor ignored them all. His focus remained on Ethan, who sat beside him in silence, his eyes occasionally meeting his father's, only to dart away again. When the gala finally ended, when the music softened and the last of the champagne glasses clinked against silver trays, father and son were left almost alone in the vast ballroom. Only a few staff remained, cleaning quietly, avoiding their eyes. Victor loosened his tie, the mask of the host finally slipping. His voice was low, almost hesitant. You didn't have to leave like that, Ethan. You didn't have to cut me out. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His words were quiet but sharp. I didn't cut you out, Dad. You pushed me out. There's a difference. The honesty of the statement pierced Victor's chest more deeply than any insult could have. He sank into the chair opposite Ethan, rubbing his temple. I thought I was teaching you discipline. That if you wanted independence, you had to earn it without me cushioning every fall. You call that discipline? Ethan snapped, his voice rising for the first time. No, Dad. That was punishment. You wanted control. And when I refused it, you let me drown. The words hung heavy in the air, echoing louder than the music that once filled the hall. Victor looked at his son, truly looked at him. The sharpness of his jaw, the fire in his eyes, the resilience in his posture. He realized this was no boy anymore. This was a man forged by hardship, by choices Victor had forced him to make. For a long moment, Victor said nothing. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "And yet you came here tonight. Why?" Ethan's gaze flickered, a storm brewing within. He hesitated, torn between silence and revelation. At last, he answered. Because I wanted to see if you still saw me as your son, or just another servant in your empire. The words struck like lightning, leaving Victor stunned. His throat tightened. His heart pounding with an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For once, the man who had commanded cities and fortunes was speechless. Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the marble floor. I got my answer tonight. But don't think one public defense changes everything. Victor rose quickly, reaching out to stop him, but his hand hovered in the air, trembling, before falling back to his side. His voice cracked as he said, Ethan, wait. Ethan paused at the edge of the ballroom, his back turned, shoulders tense. For a moment, it seemed he might walk out and disappear once more. But then Victor, a man never known for vulnerability, whispered something that stilled his son's steps. I don't know how to fix this. But I can't lose you again. The words, raw and unpolished, hung in the vast silence of the hall. Ethan's shoulders softened slightly, though he didn't turn around. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, caught between the weight of anger and the faint flicker of something he thought he'd buried long ago. Hope. And in that fragile silence, a new battle began, not between father and son, but between pride and love. Ballroom was nearly empty now, the echoes of laughter and clinking glasses replaced by the distant hum of vacuums as staff tidied up. The grandeur of the night, the glittering gowns, the symphony of violins, the sparkling chandeliers, felt hollow, like an abandoned stage after the curtain had fallen. What lingered in the air wasn't wealth or glamour anymore, but tension, thick, raw, and impossible to ignore. Victor Marlowe stood frozen in the center of it all, his words still trembling in the silence. I don't know how to fix this. But I can't lose you again. It was the closest he had ever come to a confession of weakness, and in that moment, his empire seemed to crumble. Not in the boardroom, not in his fortune, but within himself. Ethan's back remained turned, shoulders rigid. The weight of his father's words bore down on him, pulling at scars he had thought were sealed. He had expected anger, perhaps indifference, maybe even cold dismissal. But this, vulnerability, it unsettled him more than any outburst could. Finally Ethan spoke, his voice low, steady, but edged with hurt. You don't get to say that after everything you've done. After cutting me off, after humiliating me for wanting a life of my own. You don't get to stand there and suddenly decide you care because people were watching tonight. Victor flinched at the accusation. For a man who had faced corporate betrayal, political attacks, and economic collapse without blinking, it was this, his son's truth, that pierced him. He moved closer, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. It wasn't just about people watching. Victor said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its commanding edge. When I saw him grab your arm, when I saw you look at me like you'd already accepted I wouldn't defend you, Ethan. It was like something inside me broke. I realized I'd let you believe I wasn't your father anymore. Ethan's jaw clenched, his chest rising with a deep, shaky breath. He turned halfway, his face shadowed, his eyes unreadable. And isn't that what you wanted? For me to stop seeing you as a father and start seeing you as what? A boss. A dictator. Someone I owed everything to. Victor's lips parted, but no words came at first. He lowered his gaze, shame settling into the lines of his face. The truth was too harsh to deny. For years he had equated love with control, guidance with dominance. He had thought his fortune, his empire, would be a legacy his son should embrace. Instead, it had become a prison. I wanted you to be strong, Victor whispered finally. Stronger than me. I thought cutting you off would make you prove yourself. But maybe it was me proving myself, wasn't it? Proving I could still control even your freedom. The admission shocked Ethan into silence. He studied his father, searching for the mask he had always worn, the shield of arrogance and certainty. But for the first time in his life, Ethan saw Victor Marlowe not as the untouchable tycoon, but as a man, flawed and desperate, terrified of losing the only family he had left. You don't admit things like that, Ethan said, his voice quieter, uncertain. Not you. Victor let out a bitter laugh, one without joy. I've admitted less in boardrooms where billions were at stake than I just admitted to you. Do you understand what that means? Ethan's eyes narrowed, conflicted. He wanted to walk out, to cling to the independence he had fought so hard for. But his father's voice, heavy with sincerity, pulled at the cracks in his armor. Then prove it, Ethan said finally. Prove you see me as your son and not your heir. Prove you care about me and not the Marlowe name. Because if this... He gestured to the grand hall, the chandeliers, the echoes of the gala. If this is all you care about, then you've already lost me. Victor's throat tightened. His instincts screamed to respond with pride, to defend his empire, to argue that everything he had built was for Ethan. But another instinct, one he had buried under decades of ambition, urged him to listen. Then tell me how. Victor said quietly. Tell me how to prove it, Ethan. Because I don't know anymore. The vulnerability in his tone disarmed Ethan more than he expected. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. You can't just fix years of this with a speech, Dad. You can't erase the nights I wondered if you even cared where I was, how I was living. You can't erase the way you treated me like an embarrassment for walking away. Victor swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Not from anger, but from helplessness. Then don't erase it. Let it stay. Let me carry the blame. But give me a chance to do something different now. The silence stretched again, broken only by the faint clatter of a broom against marble in the distance. Ethan studied his father, searching for cracks, for signs of manipulation, but found only sincerity. For the first time in years, he felt his father's words weren't rehearsed for investors or tailored for headlines. They were raw. Real. Finally, Ethan turned fully to face him. You want to prove something? Start by showing me who you are without all of this. His hand swept toward the chandeliers, the luxury, the illusion of perfection. Because I don't know that man. I only know the empire, not the father. Victor's chest tightened, but he nodded. Slowly. Reluctantly. He had spent decades defining himself by marble floors and glittering galas. To strip that away felt like tearing out his very soul. But if it meant saving his son, then perhaps it was the only way forward. Tomorrow. Victor said, his voice firm now, steadier. No chaffiers. No gala halls. Just you and me. I'll show you who I am without the empire. Ethan tilted his head, suspicion etched across his features. And if I don't like who that man is? Victor's eyes softened, a rare vulnerability in their steel. Then at least I'll have tried. And at least you'll know the truth. But don't walk away without ever seeing me for who I really am. For the first time that night, Ethan didn't have a quick retort. He simply stood there, silent, his heart battling between resentment and the faint flicker of curiosity. At last, he gave a small nod. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. But the first step toward something both had long buried. Hope of rebuilding. As father and son left the ballroom together, the chandeliers above them dimming into darkness, the real journey was only beginning. Tomorrow would not be about wealth or power. It would be about truth. About tearing down the walls both had built, and seeing if anything human still remained beneath them. And for Victor Marlowe, the man who had never bowed to anyone, this might be his hardest battle yet. Morning sun broke over the city, painting the skyline in hues of gold and crimson. For decades, Victor Marlowe had greeted dawn with precision, a routine forged in ambition. His mornings were usually a flurry of calls, meetings, and polished perfection. But today, his penthouse remained silent. No assistants rushing in, no chauffeurs waiting downstairs, no business partners on hold. Victor sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. For the first time in years, he felt stripped of the armor of power. Today was not about empire or image. Today was about Ethan. And that frightened him more than any hostile takeover ever could. He dressed plainly. Dark jeans, a buttoned shirt, no tie. When he stepped into the hallway, Ethan was already waiting near the door. Arms crossed, a backpack slung over one shoulder. He wore sneakers and a hoodie, casual, effortless, the opposite of Victor's world. His eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of his father without his suit. "No driver?" Ethan asked. Victor shook his head. "Just us, I'll drive." They descended to the garage, the silence between them tense, heavy with unsaid words. Victor walked past rows of luxury cars, each polished to perfection, and stopped at something unexpected: an old, dented sedan tucked into the corner. Dust clung to its frame, its paint faded. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "This thing runs." Victor allowed himself a faint smile. "Barely. But it's mine. Bought it when I was your age. Before any of this." Without another word, they climbed in. The car coughed to life, its engine groaning, but it moved. As the sedan pulled out of the underground garage, Ethan stared out the window, the city rushing past. For once, they weren't looking down on it from penthouse glass. They were in it, at street level, among the people Victor had long overlooked. They drove in silence for a while until Ethan finally asked, "So where are we going?" Victor hesitated, his hands tight on the wheel. "To where it began. My old neighborhood." The cityscape shifted as they moved further from gleaming towers into worn streets lined with crumbling brick buildings. Children played soccer with a ragged ball at an alley, their laughter sharp against the quiet despair of their surroundings. Storefronts were shuttered, graffiti etched across fading walls. Ethan glanced at his father, noting the tension in his jaw. "This is where you grew up?" he asked. Victor nodded. "One room, 4 people. My father worked 2 jobs. My mother sold food at the corner. It wasn't much, but it was enough to teach me hunger." Ethan studied him, caught off guard by the honesty. He had always known his father was self-made, but the story had always been wrapped in polished speeches, stripped of rawness. Now, the cracks showed. Victor parked the car in front of a worn building with peeling paint. He stepped out, his movements slower, heavier, as though every brick carried a memory. Ethan followed, uncertain but curious. "This was our home," Victor said quietly, pointing to a small apartment window on the 3rd floor. "One bed for my parents. A mattress on the floor for me and your uncle. Winters were brutal. Summers worse. But it made me fight for more." Ethan's gaze softened despite himself. "And in that fight, you lost what?" "The people you loved." Victor didn't answer at first. He looked at his son, his eyes darkened by shadows of the past. "I lost balance. I thought giving you a mansion, an empire, would mean you never had to feel what I felt. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you. I only saw the empire." The words struck deep. Ethan shoved his hands into his hoodie pocket, his voice low. "I didn't need the empire, Dad. I just needed a father who was there." Victor closed his eyes for a moment, the truth slicing deeper than any deal gone wrong. He turned away, walking slowly down the street until they reached a small diner. Its neon sign flickered weakly, the smell of frying eggs drifting through the air. He pushed the door open, the bell above jingling softly. Inside, it was nothing like the Marlowe estate. The booths were torn, the floor scuffed, the air heavy with grease and coffee. Yet Victor's face softened with nostalgia. "This is where I worked my first job," he said as they slid into a booth. "Washing dishes. Mopping floors. Every dollar I made here went into saving for something better." A waitress approached, smiling warmly at Victor. "Haven't seen you in years. Still remember that mop in your hand though?" Ethan blinked, startled. His father, the man who owned skyscrapers, reduced to a memory of scrubbing floors. He watched as Victor ordered 2 coffees and a plate of eggs, nothing extravagant. They sat in silence until Ethan finally asked, "Why show me this now?" Victor's hands wrapped around the coffee mug, his voice low. "Because I don't want you to think this." He gestured vaguely, meaning the empire, the power, the mansion. "Is who I've always been. Before all of that, I was just a kid desperate to prove himself. And maybe I forced that desperation onto you. Maybe I thought if I made you struggle, you'd find strength the way I did." Ethan leaned forward, eyes sharp. "But you don't get it. I didn't need to become you. I needed to become me." But the words hit like a hammer. Victor looked down, his chest heavy. "I know. And I see that now. But I don't know how to undo what I've done." The conversation faltered, but in the silence, something shifted. For the first time, Ethan didn't see Victor as the man who had humiliated him, but as a man who had once been small, afraid, clawing his way up from nothing. The empire wasn't built on arrogance. It was built on fear. Fear of returning to this place, to hunger, to insignificance. And for the first time, Ethan began to understand his father's chains. They finished their meal quietly. As they stepped outside, the city buzzed around them. Honking cars, shouting vendors, laughing children. Victor looked at his son, his face etched with sincerity. I can't change the past, Ethan. But if you'll let me, I want to be different now. Not as Victor Marlowe the tycoon, but as your father. But Ethan studied him, torn. The walls around his heart were high, but cracks were forming. For the first time in years, he considered the possibility of letting his father back in. Yet before he could answer, a sudden voice from behind shattered the fragile moment. Well, well. If it isn't Victor Marlowe, back where he belongs. Victor stiffened. Ethan turned to see a man in a leather jacket, scars cutting across his face, flanked by two others. Their smirks carried menace, and their presence shifted the air. Victor's past, it seemed, wasn't finished with him yet. The street outside the diner suddenly felt narrower, darker, as though the towering city buildings leaned in to watch what was about to unfold. Victor Marlowe turned slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowing at the figure before him. Time had aged them both, but recognition hit instantly. Marcus Hale, Victor muttered, his tone carrying the weight of memories best left buried. The man in the leather jacket grinned, his scar tugging at the corner of his mouth. So you do remember me. The boy who used to run these streets with you. Except, unlike you, I didn't get a golden ladder to climb out. You left us all here, Vic. Left me here to rot while you became a king in your glass castle. Ethan's eyes darted between them, confusion and unease rising. Dad, who is he? Victor's voice hardened. An old ghost. Marcus stepped closer, his two companions fanning out behind him, their postures casual but threatening. Ghost? No, I'm flesh and blood. And I've been waiting a long time to see you again. Imagine my surprise when I spot Victor Marlowe, billionaire, waltzing back into the neighborhood like he owns the place. Thought you'd forgotten us. Victor's chest tightened, old guilt crawling up his spine. I didn't forget. I survived. There's a difference. Marcus laughed bitterly, his voice carrying across the cracked pavement. Survived, you abandoned. We were brothers, Vic. We starved together, we fought for scraps together. And when opportunity came knocking, you slammed the door behind you and never looked back. Ethan stepped forward, protective instinct flashing in his eyes. Back off. You've got a problem with him, fine, but don't drag me into it. Marcus's gaze slid to Ethan, his grin widening. This your boy? Huh. Looks like money didn't buy him the same sharp edges you had. He's softer, easier to break. Ethan's fists clenched, but Victor's hand shot out, firm on his son's shoulder. His voice dropped, quiet but urgent. Don't, he wants a fight. Marcus tilted his head, mock pity dripping from his words. Listen to Daddy. Still pulling the strings, huh? Always the one in control. That's the Victor I know. Victor straightened, his tone cold as steel. What do you want, Marcus? The smile vanished. Marcus's eyes hardened, venom spilling into every word. I want what you owe. You built an empire off the back of every promise you made to us. We bled together, and you swore if you ever got out, you'd come back for us. You never did. And while you were sipping champagne in penthouses, I was rotting in prison. You think you can walk back here, play humble, and wash away the past? Ethan's heart pounded. He turned sharply toward his father. Is that true? Did you promise them? Victor's throat tightened. His silence answered before his words did. I was young. Desperate. I said a lot of things to survive. Marcus sneered. And none of it meant a damn thing, did it? Well, here's the reality, Vic. You can't buy your way out of this one. The tension on the street was suffocating. A group of kids across the way stopped their soccer game, eyes wide as they watched. Shopkeepers peered nervously from behind their windows. The legend of Victor Marlowe had returned to his roots, and the neighborhood was holding its breath. Ethan stepped closer to his father, voice sharp. So what now? They want money, is that it? Marcus chuckled darkly. Money? Do I look like some desperate beggar to you? I don't want your scraps. I want you to feel what it's like to lose. To be powerless. To watch everything you built crumble. He snapped his fingers, and one of his men pulled a phone from his pocket, holding it up so Victor could see. On the screen were photos, Victor's offices, his mansion, even the gala from the night before. Detailed, personal, watched. We've been keeping tabs, Vic. Marcus said softly, menacingly. One call from me, and all those pretty glass towers of yours. They fall. The press eats up your scandals, your investors scatter, and you'll be back where you started. On these streets. Only this time, no way out. Ethan's stomach turned cold. You're threatening him. You can't. Marcus cut him off with a sharp laugh. Can't. Kid, the world isn't built on can't. It's built on who's willing to cross the line. Your father knows that better than anyone. Isn't that right, Vic? Victor's fists clenched at his sides. His mind raced. Not with fear for his fortune, but with the realization that his past had followed him, and worse, it had caught his son in the crossfire. He stepped forward, shielding Ethan slightly. His voice measured but heavy with fury. If you think you can break me with threats, Marcus, you've already forgotten who I am. I built everything I have from nothing. You can burn it to the ground and I'll build it again. But if you lay a hand on my son... His voice dropped, lethal in its promise. You won't leave this street. For a moment, silence reigned. The weight of Victor's words hanging in the air. Marcus studied him, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. Then he smirked, stepping back. Still the same Victor. Always the fighter. Always the king. His grin widened. But kings fall, my old friend. And when you do, I'll be there to watch. With a sharp gesture, he turned, his men following. The three of them disappeared down the street, leaving behind only the echo of their threat. Ethan exhaled shakily, his pulse racing. What the hell was that, Dad? Who are these people? Victor's shoulders sagged, the years pressing down on him all at once. He looked at his son, his voice low, burdened. They're the past I tried to bury. And now, they're the past I have to face. Ethan's anger flared. And you dragged me into it. You say you want to prove you're my father, but all I see is a man who's spent his life making enemies. What happens when they come after me? After everything I've tried to build for myself? Victor stepped closer, his tone firm, almost desperate. Then I'll stand in front of you. I'll protect you with everything I have. That's my promise, Ethan. But Ethan shook his head, his voice sharp with bitterness. Promises don't mean much coming from you right now. Victor froze, his son's words cutting deeper than Marcus's threats ever could. And as the street grew quiet again, one truth became painfully clear: protecting his empire was easy. Protecting his son's trust, that would be the hardest battle of his life. The city at night was a restless beast. Its veins glowing with headlights, its lungs filled with sirens and whispers. Victor Marlowe stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony, looking down at the metropolis he had once believed untouchable. The skyline glittered like armor, but to him it looked fragile, vulnerable. A glass empire waiting for one crack to spread. Behind him, Ethan paced, restless, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. The silence between them was sharp, cutting deeper than any argument. Finally, Ethan spoke. You should have told me, he said flatly. Victor turned, his eyes heavy. Told you what? That I was a street rat who made promises he couldn't keep. That I clawed my way out while others drowned. What good would that have done, Ethan? Ethan stopped, meeting his father's gaze. It would have told me you're human. That you didn't build all this alone. That people mattered more to you than money. Victor flinched as if struck. For a moment, he saw not his son but the boy he used to be. Hungry, desperate, clutching to loyalty as though it were life itself. Marcus's words echoed in his skull, you left us to rot. Before he could left us to rot, Victor's phone buzzed a message. He opened it, and his heart hardened. A photo of Ethan leaving the diner earlier, time-stamped only minutes ago. The caption was short. You can't protect him forever. Victor shoved the phone into his pocket and strode to the elevator. Stay here, he ordered. Ethan blocked him. No, I'm done being sidelined. If this is about me, I'm going with you. For Victor's jaw tightened. For the first time, he saw the fire in his son. Not the softness Marcus mocked, but strength. His strength. He gave a curt nod. Then stay close. And don't flinch. They found Marcus in the skeleton of an abandoned warehouse on the riverfront, shadows wrapping the rusted beams like hungry fingers. A single hanging light swayed above, casting Marcus and his two men in sharp, fractured outlines. Victor, Marcus said, his grin wide, cruel. I knew you wouldn't run. Pride never let you. Victor stepped forward, his voice like iron. You want to settle old debts? Fine. But leave my son out of it. Marcus's laugh echoed through the hollow space. Leave him out. He's the perfect piece on the board. He's your weakness. And I want you to feel what it's like when the world takes what you love most. Ethan's stomach knotted, but he held his ground. You don't scare me. Marcus's grin flickered. Brave words. But I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to end him. He pointed at Victor. The great Marlowe. The king who abandoned his kingdom. Victor's fists curled. I built a life, Marcus. You chose chains. Don't put your failures on me. Marcus's scarred face twisted with fury. Failures. You think I had a choice? You think the streets offered me a golden ladder like they did you? He took a step forward, voice breaking with venom. No one saved me, Vic. And if I can't have salvation, neither can you. His men moved, circling. Victor's body tensed, instincts from a life he thought he'd buried roaring back. He stepped in front of Ethan, shielding him. Stay behind me, he whispered. But Ethan shook his head, stepping up beside him. Not this time. The first man lunged. Victor blocked, his fist cracking against the man's jaw. Years of rust hadn't dulled his strike. Ethan caught the second man, ducking a wild swing and shoving him into a steel beam with a grunt of determination. For a moment, Victor saw it. His son fighting, not because he had to, but because he refused to let his father face this alone. Pride surged in his chest. Marcus, snarling, grabbed a length of chain from the floor and swung it. Victor twisted, the chain slicing his shoulder, pain burning hot. But he held firm. "Nuff!" Victor roared, his voice shaking the rafters. He lunged, gripping Marcus by the collar, slamming him against the wall. You want to blame me? Fine. Hate me all you want. But this ends with me, not him. Marcus's breath came ragged, his eyes wild. Then watch everything burn. He reached into his jacket, pulling a small detonator. Victor's blood ran cold. Ethan's voice cut through, fierce and unwavering. You don't get to control him anymore. Before Marcus could press the button, Ethan tackled him, the detonator clattering across the floor. Victor dove, kicking it away, his heart thundering. The warehouse filled with silence, broken, ragged breaths, fists trembling, chains swaying. Victor looked down at his son, who stood over Marcus, chest heaving. Ethan's eyes met his father's, blazing with anger and pride. You taught me to fight tonight. Ethan said, voice shaking. Not with your empire. Not with money. But with you. Marcus spat blood, glaring up at them. This isn't over. You'll always be one of us, Victor. Always. Victor's grip tightened on Ethan's shoulder, steadying him. His voice came low, final. No. Tonight proves I'm something more. We are something more. He pulled Ethan close, guiding him out of the warehouse, leaving Marcus behind in the wreckage of his own rage. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the river, the skyline gleaming like a promise. Victor exhaled, the weight of years lifting, if only slightly. Ethan stood beside him, bruised but unbroken. For the first time, father and son didn't feel like strangers. Victor spoke quietly, the words heavy with truth. I can't erase the past, Ethan. But I can fight for the future. For our future. If you'll let me. Ethan's eyes softened, a flicker of trust breaking through the storm. Then fight. But not just for me. Fight with me. Victor's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't regret. It was hope. For years, he had built towers of steel and glass, empires of numbers.